Today we are going to learn about macromolecules. We're going to go through the 4 different categories of macromolecules: carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. If you remember when we talked about macro, so macro is large. So we're talking about large molecules that pertain to life. The first group of molecules we're going to talk about are the carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are organic molecules. So if you think back, organic means it has carbon. And if you recall, carbon is a really cool molecule because it can bond to 4 different things at one time. So it allows for these really cool structures. With carbohydrates, it's going to allow for a ring structure like seen over here in the different types of monosaccharides. Carbohydrates are organic molecules composed of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Interesting fact about carbohydrates is that for every carbon, there will be 2 hydrogen and 1 oxygen. And so the chemical formula for the carbohydrates is going to be CH2O. The monomer, so if you think back to monomer, mono being 1, the 1 or the single subunit of a carbohydrate is known as a monosaccharide. And so we can break the word monosaccharide apart, and we have mono, which is 1, and then saccharide, which is sugar. So when we talk about a monosaccharide or a monomer of a carbohydrate, they are known as monosaccharides or 1 sugar. Some examples of monosaccharides: the most common one would be glucose. We will talk about glucose in pretty big depth when we talk about photosynthesis later on in the second trimester. Fructose is also a monosaccharide, as is galactose. Interesting thing about all 3 of these monosaccharides is that their chemical formula is C6H12, so twice as many hydrogen, O6. And the difference between them is not what it's made up of, but the difference is actually how the carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen are arranged. If you were to taste all 3 of those, they would taste very different. When we string monomers or monosaccharides in this situation, when we put them together and we put many, so poly being many, and when we have many saccharides being sugar again, we have many sugars strung together. That is known as a polysaccharide. So a polysaccharide would be many sugars. So I would have a glucose connected to a glucose, connected to a glucose, connected to a glucose, connected to a glucose. And they just continue to bond together. Now, if you remember, when 2 monosaccharides bond together, what do they have to get rid of? They have to get rid of water. They bond together through a process of dehydration synthesis. Sometimes with carbohydrates, we will talk about 2 carbohydrates or 2 monosaccharides bonded together. For example, if we were to come back up here, and let's go ahead and I'll erase this around the glucose. If we were to talk about bonding, let's say the glucose with the fructose. If these 2 were to bond together, what would happen is we would lose the hydroxyl group here, we'd lose the hydrogen here, and out would come water, H2O, and the glucose and the fructose would bond together and they would form a double sugar. So there would be 2 sugars there, and we call those a di. Di is 2 sugars. So disaccharide, 2 sugars. In this case, we take glucose, so glucose plus fructose minus the water, of course, you would actually get sucrose. Sucrose is the table sugar. That's the most common sugar that you all are familiar with. It's the one you have in your cupboard at home. So looking back at the carbohydrate structure, right here is our example of the disaccharide. Two sugars, glucose and fructose, make sucrose. You had to just get rid of the water. So that is a double sugar, a disaccharide. When we link many saccharides together, we get a poly. Poly is many. An example of a polysaccharide would be starch. So right here you can see I have a glucose and another glucose and another glucose and another glucose and another glucose, and they're all bonded together. So this gives me a poly because there are many saccharide. Another name for a polysaccharide would be a complex carbohydrate. So these two words would be interchangeable. A polysaccharide is a complex carbohydrate. One example would be starch. Starch is going to be a great example. It would be found in plants. So let's go ahead and take a look at a real example. So let's say I have this crazy awesome potato plant, has all these leaves up above, and then it has the roots that go under the ground, and off of these roots we have some potatoes. Well, where do these potatoes come from? These potatoes are actually large vacuoles inside a cell that is filling up with this starch. So we talk about starch and we eat potatoes. Potatoes are going to have starch in them. Where does that starch come from? Well, if you think back, starch has carbon, it has hydrogen, and it has oxygen. And so if you think about where those come from, carbon dioxide is in the air and the plant takes it in. And the sunlight is what's going to give us our energy. The plant also is taking up water. So water goes in. And the cool thing about this is that in the plant, you have the carbon. So carbon. You have the hydrogen. You have the hydrogen. And you have the oxygen and oxygen. And so this is where we get sugars from the carbon dioxide in the air and the water in the soil that goes up through the plants. When this potato plant makes sugar from carbon dioxide and water, it's not really sure what to do with it. And so it makes a lot of glucose molecules, but rather than just storing the glucose, it actually starts to take one glucose and it bonds it to another glucose, to another glucose, to another glucose, to another glucose, and so on and so forth until it has this really long chain, or this polysaccharide. So this is a polysaccharide. And this polysaccharide is known as starch. And it takes this molecule and it stores it, sends it down to the roots, and it stores it in the vacuoles inside the cells of the root. And that is where potato comes from. It's stored starch from the potato plant. So right here, if we look, this would be a drawing. The whole thing together would be a polysaccharide. If we were to look at one individual, that would be a monosaccharide. So a monosaccharide joined together through dehydration synthesis gives us a polysaccharide. So why are carbohydrates so important? Well, number one, biggest, most important factor is the reality that they are our source of energy. Boom. They are our source of energy. We eat carbohydrates to get energy. Energy is stored in the carbon and hydrogen bonds. And so when we break those bonds, we're able to then ultimately get some ATP or cellular energy from that. When we look at animals, so if we're talking about animals and plants do not have the same types of carbohydrates. And this is what's important. This is why those chemical reactions are so important to understand, is because a plant is able to make a certain, a certain carbohydrate. We eat that carbohydrate, but we have to be able to break it down and then rebuild it back up into the carbohydrate that we need. And so one common carbohydrate that is found in animals, you and I are animals, so we store carbohydrates in this form of glycogen. And so glycogen is a polysaccharide, and it's basically stored energy for a little bit of time. So it's a source of energy. And we store it in our liver and in our muscle. So think about muscles. We ask them to do a lot of work. We need a source of energy there all the time, so the muscles can do what we demand them to do. This is why animals are so different than plants. Animals need or require a lot more energy than plants do. Plants, however, have to have a very strong, rigid structural material so they can grow really tall. And so plants have a specific polysaccharide known as cellulose, not cellulite, but cellulose. Cellulose is found in the cell walls of plants. So if you ever think about why can a tree grow so tall, well, it's because in all of the little tiny cells, there are cell walls surrounding those, and those cell walls are made of a very structural, sound component that we call cellulose. Cellulose is a carbohydrate. So what's that mean? Well, it's a molecule that's big, and it's made of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen in that CH2O ratio. We can eat cellulose, but we can't break it down. Cows break it down a little bit, but not really the cow. It's the bacteria in the gut of the cow. And so when we take in cellulose and we eat plants, the outside typically, we call it dietary fiber. It helps keep our systems regular. And so plants are going to all have cellulose. Animals will not. Animals will have glycogen. Plants will not. Looking at some examples, where do we get our carbohydrates from? Well, if you break them down into mono, so these are the simple, we call these simple sugars. That would be glucose, galactose, fructose, and ribose. Ribose is in RNA, so we don't really talk about where we get that one, but fructose is from fruit. Galactose is different sweeteners in foods. Glucose we get from a lot of different organisms, a lot of different food sources, and we actually break most sugars down into glucose. Disaccharides would probably be the most common source that we get. Lactose, those of you who are lactose intolerant, that means you can't break this particular disaccharide down. It goes right through your system. Those are found in milk. Sucrose would be that basic white table sugar. The better of the carbohydrates for us, because it gives us long-term, so these are our complex carbs, would be starch, glycogen, cellulose, and another type of starch called amylopectin. Different places that we're going to get those complex carbohydrates would be pastas, whole grains, cereals, potatoes, and different items of food like that. All right, so that wraps up carbohydrates.